Hey everyone, this is going to be a brief video on how to rig a plate with PD movies onto the poly head. We're actually going to look a bit more in depth as to how to mount these three lens motors and this particular lens holder onto an assembly that all fits with a particular lens to in the end mount it onto the poly head. So to mount the full assembly, you'll need a camera. In this particular case, it'll be a mini Ursa. Then we'll need the rigging plates, the distancing shim, along with the two screws to actually mount this. On there, we'll mount three lens motors, the lens holding. To put it all together, we'll mount it onto a poly head. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we'll actually want to take a look at the spacing between the mounting plate and the carbon tubes. So there's a couple of things that you want to look at, especially when it comes with regards to the carbon tubes. You'll notice that as I place it directly onto the camera, I don't have so much space here. And this will probably become a problem later on once I try to mount the PD movies because they'll come all the way to the top of the lens. Now I can do two things to resolve this. The first thing I can do is to add a shim. So I could just take this particular shim, we'll usually ship it with it, and put it here, and we'll gain some space in order to have this vertical distance to nicely reach the midline of the lens. An alternative thing that we can do is to take this particular assembly and mount it on top here instead of at the bottom, so there we'll also win a particular distance. There will be some additional tricks with the mounting of the PD movies themselves, but I'll show that later on what that actually looks like. So let's talk a bit more about the carbon tubes and how to choose them. If everything went according to plan, we'll have shipped you 3 different sizes of carbon tubes. And it's a bit up to you to decide which ones you want to use. It'll also depend on the type of lens that you have. I think these particular ones are the medium or the longer ones, if I'm not mistaken. And while you're choosing the length, there's the typical thing that you want to pay attention to is the spacing between these particular lines. And what we're doing here is we're making sure that the PD movies can fit each one onto one of these. Now you'll notice in particular that here we've actually mounted an additional strip onto the lens. And the reason for that is we can't fit all 3 of the PD movies next to each other without them interfering with each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to move one of the PD movies a bit further over, and they're going to control this part simply by using the lens gear strip. Then lastly, you want to make sure that the carbon tubes reach all the way to the end of the lens, which is where we're going to mount the lens gear holder, essentially to hold the lens stable. So we want to make sure that the carbon tubes also cover this part at the very last. So that would be the first part, I think. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually mount these particular things. I'll need the screwdriver to get that done. The next thing that we're going to look at is the spacing between the PD movies. So I'll just take one of these, for example. And you can see, so for example, from the height perspective, this will work out more or less because the holder will appear here. It'll be somewhere here on the lens, so this will work. So with the holders that they actually have, you can mount them 2 ways. In this particular case, I'm going to mount them like this because I'll want a bit more of the height. Alternatively, you could also just inverse them and have it lower. You lose a bit of height, maybe that's more suitable to your particular lens configuration, but given the shim, we're going to go ahead and take the higher option. So all I have to do is see if I can get that on there and more or less place it at the height. And I can of course check with the actual movie whether I can actually fit it. That's the case, it's looking good. Then I'll mount the other 2 in much the same way, make sure that it fits. Now you'll notice here for the third one, so this is what I talked about. The spacing won't work out. Between these 2, it won't be an issue, but we can't have our third PD movie sit exactly here, and that's also due to the thickness of having multiple gears on there. So the way that we solve this is by adding a lens gear strip, and this still controls the same part of the lens. It's just a thicker strip that is sitting a bit wider, so we kind of have that breathing space between the 2 last motors that are actually actuating the lens. We've also included the guide probably. If we shipped you these gear strips, we've also shipped you a guide on how to mount them, but it's really just a zip tie around this part of the lens. So that's the last part that I'll have to do. I'll see if I can just mount the PD movies on here. I'll have to loosen it a bit more. There we go. And while I'm tightening, so you can see I'm a bit off on my spacing, and while we are mounting them, we'll want to make sure that we're already kind of close to the midpoint of the lens. And the reason that we want to do that is as we're moving or as we're actuating these motors, they're going to induce a force onto the lens. And if you do that in the middle of the lens, you only have a very controlled force. Whereas if you do it too high or too low, you'll actually have a diagonal force going across your lens. So we'll want to make sure that we're already now more or less halfway point to the lens. We can still adjust it, fine tune it a bit later on, but this is a good start. So let's mount the first one. And grab the motors for the second one and mount them on there as well. There we go. You can already see the spacing becoming pretty tight between the two motors. Let's see if I can face it a bit more towards the camera. So you can see it's already pretty tight between the two. Though I still have some space, I could also move this one over a bit if I wanted to. Just so you get the idea a bit. There we go. And as I'm doing that, I'm also making sure that I'm nicely pressing the motors against the lens to have a nice pushing over of the contact so that it doesn't slide across my gear wheels. And then we'll mount the last one. And so now you can really see that it was useful to take that additional spacing with the gear strip, because once I'll mount this one, I'll push it a bit further just to have it somewhere there. You'll notice that there was no way that I could have placed this particular motor on the way where actually already this, I'll take it off, maybe you can see it a bit more. You can see that it's already kind of covered by the second motor. There's no way I could have reached this particular strip. That's why we're using this one. So I'll quickly mount that on there as well. I think I need to shift a bit more and fit it nicely. There we go. Fit it nicely, just about halfway. I mean, again, we can always adjust this later on. And nicely tighten it. Also make sure that it's nicely pushing against the lens so that there's a nice force transfer here. And that's it. We should have all three of our PD movies mounted. The idea about the lens holder is that it holds the lens steadily in place despite any forces being applied, for example, by the lens motors. One thing to note about it is that you can actually alter the distance between the mounting tubes and the actual lens by moving this small screw over here, which will allow you to kind of move it up and down over this particular rod. So in order to actually mount it onto the rig, all we have to do is place it over the carbon tubes, and then I'll mount it, but not too tight just yet. And only once I'm actually going to place it onto the total assembly with the camera, I'll see more or less where I'll need to fit the lens and the lens holder in order for it to sit on the absolute ultimate part of the lens and not in the middle of any of the rings, for example. Right, so I've assembled the entire rig, I've mounted it onto the camera, and all I have to do now is to just tighten it on both sides and tighten the Velcro. Nicely tighten it around the lens. Should be good to go. Some people have incredible technical talent and they do these things in a matter of minutes. If you're more like me, then you'll probably have iterated over this a couple of times trying to fit the right spacing for the PD movies, the lens holder, going back to maybe the spacing on your shim, etc. But we're going to assume that eventually you've reached a stable assembly of the heads, and now it's just a matter of mounting it actually. Here we're going to see again that mounting it should be fairly comfortable, don't even necessarily need to slide it in. And the last thing I want to check actually is whether as it stands, the camera is more or less balanced as it stands on the head. So I want to make sure that if I do this, it doesn't immediately slam back, it just goes nicely back to its position, and the other way around as well. It kind of holds the position by having it more or less in the center. Obviously for a camera that's relatively small like this one, the weight for the poly head doesn't matter so much. If you've got a bigger camera, however, this may turn out to be important. Otherwise, it's harder for the motor to go through the full range of motion. Alrighty, so that should be it. That should be mounting the PD movies and actually rigging the whole thing onto the head. Hope that answered most of your questions. Obviously here the lens cables are still missing, but I'll trust that you can figure out how to mount those. And yeah, if there's any questions still, don't hesitate to try to reach out to us. Just email us, or any other ways of contact that you have with us, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to help you. Thanks.